Welcome, everybody. This started off as just very, very quickly. We've got about an hour, so the first 45 minutes will be pretty much over to John. It's a bizarre thing. I'm pointing here because he's sort of there to me. I don't know where he is to everybody else, but hopefully this kind of started a conversation with myself and Jennifer about this kind of bourrique that we're in at the moment, and we're not getting to go to events, and I think everybody just wants a wee moment here or thereabouts for an hour or so, just to just to chill out and listen to a fine poet. And I can't think of any better than our guest this evening. So we'll run one or two of these over the month of January and into early February, and then possibly, if everybody likes it, maybe do one a month after that. But without further ado, I'll introduce our very first guest. And the title of this evening's wee blether is From Source to Firth. And the guest is John Glenday, who, in my humble opinion, and not because he told me to say just this, but is one of Scotland's finest poets. And he's a poet at the top of his craft. He's the author of 4 collections. Grain in 2009 was shortlisted for the Griffin International Poetry Prize and the Ted Hughes Award. Golden Mean in 2016 won the Roehampton Poetry Prize. And his most recent publications are a limited edition art book, Mira or Myra, I'm never very sure how you pronounce that one, John. A wonderful wee limited edition art book, a pamphlet called Firth, and his last but not least, a selected poems collection. So he's been a busy, busy man, even in the last couple of years and during lockdown. So please, we don't put our hands together, I guess. We all just wave at the camera nowadays. We've all turned into the Chuckle Brothers and done double waves and stuff. But welcome, John Glenday. So at the moment, everybody should be on mute other than possibly John and I. See, it calls me Liz there, so I'll have to speak to my better half about that. John, welcome.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you for that fulsome introduction. I mean, I'm so glad that was recorded. I can listen to it again and again on evenings when I can't sleep, you know.
Well, I should probably recorded it for you. Well, I'll probably listen to it myself. Did I get it right?
It was great. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being our guest, John. I guess the thing for me was from source to Firth. Yeah, there's a little bit of a clue in there that Firth is obviously one of the end products and your most recent books. Mm-hmm. And I guess you're the source of that, but it works on very many levels. And a lot of the themes that we talked about for this evening were those bits on the journey from the source, whether that's the tributaries off of that or the main flow of that to the Firth, to the estuary, and the end product. And some of that you talked about was landscape and how that features quite heavily in your poetry. I think my first question is are you the landscape? Are you in the landscape, or are you part of the landscape? And which landscape is that? And what I should add, just when you're thinking about that, John, is what John's going to do is read, hopefully, a few poems along the way. So read as many poems as you want. But here's my first question to you, John.
Am I the landscape, part of the landscape, in the landscape? I think I'm all three, Jim. Everything I write is rooted in place, even though the poem itself doesn't make that apparent, doesn't make that obvious. I'm always writing from quite literally from a point of view. You know, I'm looking out at something and writing, if not about it, about something that relates to it. So I am all three. In some of these poems, it's an internal landscape, I suppose I'm describing. It's the country that inhabits us that I'm describing. And in some, I'm trying to put into words how important where I live and where I come from are to me. To give you a bit of background, I was born in this area. I was actually born in Broughty Ferry, but I grew up in Moneyfeith. My surname is part of this area. I mean, there are 2 places in Angus called Glenday, right, which Glenday comes from. So I can really get in the car and drive and have a look at my surname where it lies in the landscape of North Angus. And in my, I lived here a long time. I moved away when I was in my mid-20s, came back again to lived in Dundee for a while, and then moved away up north. And I was up north for 15 more years. And after I retired, I suddenly had this compulsion to come back to where I came from, like a salmon that finds its way back upriver to the very spot where it was born. I wanted to come back to my area, and so now I'm back in Carnoustie. And there is something incredibly important to me in that, that this is where I come from. You know, that my father was born in Monteith and grew up there, that his father was the blacksmith at the foundry that's no longer there, that my great-grandfather was the blacksmith in Carnoustie, but in Barry. But the other interesting thing, and I'll come back to this again, is however much of belonging to this area I feel, I'm also acutely aware that we're all migrants, that we all came from somewhere else. But I think I'll start off with a poem which talks about two aspects of what I mean by belonging. And one is we belong to a place because we physically live there or we grew up there. And we also belong to a place through our DNA, you know, who our parents were, what our ancestors did. So our blood joins us to a place as well. I suppose a good description of what I'm trying to do comes from, and I think, Jim, you'll probably be able to correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I think it was William Souter, the Perth poet, who described the three essential relationships for the poet. Is that right? Right? I'm sure it was Souter. And he said, the writer has three essential relationships, and it's the individual to other people, of course, to society, a social relationship, if you like, the individual to the landscape, and the individual to the past. So people, landscape, past. You cannot survive as a writer without those three. And I'm hoping that in this pamphlet, all three are apparent. You know, the past is certainly there. My social relationship with family and those around me is certainly there. And the landscape encompasses all three of them. But I'll start with a poem which was one of the first that appeared, actually, called The Bar. And of course, the bar is that point where the detritus, the silt carried down by a river, is deposited where it meets the sea. And it's a bar of shallower water, or even sandbanks, where that happens. And to me, it marked that point where fresh water becomes salt, where the particular of the river becomes the general of the sea, of the ocean. The bar. That morning, from our bench by the ranges, we followed a single North Sea wave driving upriver, too far away to touch, too close to bear. And at the bar, because the shallows gather there, watched how it rose above itself, proud and triumphant, as I did once, until the wind, that white blade carding the winter from the Firth, cut through, feathering its crest to a brief, astonished haze, then sent it withering back towards whatever it had always been, or where it came from. And I think it's those two elements that I'm trying to capture, whatever it has always been. You know, what am I through my blood? What have I always been that I'm working to describe through words? And where I come from is, what does the land mean to me? You know, what is the land, more importantly, trying to say to me? What metaphorical presence does the land have in my life? I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that archaeologists, you know, they can do something like look at the remains of Ötzi, this was he 5,000-year-old hunter that died in the Alps, in the Italian Alps.
Yeah.
And I've been lucky enough to go and look at him. I met him in Bolzano a few years ago. He doesn't say much these days, but he's a convincing guy to me. But they can look at the enamel on his teeth and tell you what part of the country he lived in and what food he ate, where that food was grown. You know, that's how minutely they can do it now. So the landscape, it's not just where we live, but it does live in us. It's part of us, where we come from. It's incredibly important.
Yeah.
So in the bar, I just tried to balance those two, the idea of blood and landscape. The past, if you like, and landscape.
You've got a second one you want to read, and then, yeah.
Well, I suppose, yeah. Yes. It's because I'm always anxious when I'm talking about this is where I come from, you know, and it's this idea that we do all come from somewhere else. And the pamphlet is full of weeds. It's full of wildflowers. I call them wildflowers. Other people call a flower that's in the wrong place a weed. And unfortunately, we do the same with human beings. If we feel they're in the wrong place, we treat them as if they're weeds. And if we think back, you know, 20,000 years ago, now that's a tiny portion of time in the life of this planet. That this tiny fragment of time ago, 20,000 years ago, there was a huge lump of ice sitting on top of Scotland. So nobody lived here. And what's more, because there was so much of the ocean gathered up in ice, the water levels were much lower. So we were actually joined to Europe at that point. That was the good old days. You know, we were part of Europe. And you could walk across Doggerland into the flatlands of Belgium.
So we need more ice, John. Is that what you're saying?
We need more ice, and then you know we could cycle to Maastricht. You know,
we'll all be dead, but we'll be connected again.
Right. But 20,000 years ago, there was no one here.
Yeah.
I know there would have been hunter-gatherers moving in and coming seasonally and maybe fishing or whatever, but nobody lived here. We've all moved here from somewhere else.
Yeah.
And one of the poems from Wildflower, Bird's Foot Trefoil, tries to talk a little about that. Wildflower, Bird's Foot Trefoil. Look at us for once, just for a moment. Look at us down here, but please don't look down on us, though we're most ordinary and commonplace and all seem quite alike and probably not wanted, not here, not in your backyard. Look at us so that we might begin to grow into ourselves, to become real for you. The veins of blood along the blossom, the cupped petals, the downy leaves. Don't glance, gaze into us with a regard that allows us to believe we must truly exist as you do, because we observe you with the intensity of the flower. Don't hurry. It will prove worthwhile. Look at us as we deserve to be seen. It won't be a waste of time. In fact, it might just change your life.
Yeah, wonderful. It reminds me. I mean, I was thinking about the talk today. I mean, John, you've probably been doing much the same. We've all had that ration of a daily exercise from about March last year, and then we've had various stages of lockdown or whatever since. And it's one of the things that my wife and I decided to do way back in March was, right, we're going to do this every day. And we would come across a plant or a tree or something that we thought, right, it's not just a tree. We would actually fine each other 50p if you called it just a tree or just a mallard. You know, we had to, so every day we would come back and say, what is that plant? You know, and go and do the research on it. And there isn't, as you say, there are not wildflowers, they're just flowers. They're not weeds. There's nothing, we're all weeds, as you say, you know. We're just in the wrong place, some of us. My wife is now the umbellifer expert for us. That's cow parsley and hogweed and that, by the way, for anybody that hasn't, go and look them up. Has in that, to that extent, yes, you're very much influenced by wildflowers, we'll settle on that. But has, to the same degree as I've just said there, has the pandemic over the last year influenced, for good reasons or bad reasons, how you approach what you have in the past in terms of your connection with the landscape?
I think it's made it more precious to me. So I was really pleased that the pamphlet, I have to say, Jim, I'm going to admit to everyone now that I haven't written a bloody word since last March. I haven't written a thing. Well, I do. I keep a diary and things. I've got rough notes, but I haven't written completed a poem since last March.
So you're a trendsetter, and then as much as what you've just read is basically what I'm saying. I've just kind of caught. Well, I'm not really caught up with, because it's kind of what I've always been, much the same influences yourself on that one. But it's interesting you're saying that. Is that because you've just been focused on other things, or not inspired, or
I've probably just not been in quite the right place. You know, it's worrying times. Things are changing, and if you think of the landscape, you know, not just virological, but the political landscape over the last 12 months as well. You know how. Well, I'm not going to go into it, but there's lots and lots of things going on, and so it can be unsettling. But I think also it, in a terrible way, it put literature in perspective, and I think, God, are there more important things going on out there? You know,
interesting. Do you think it's more? Is the poet's role? I mean, I would say it's a role. Is your role to record, or should you be writing about the influence of the pandemic on us, or do you feel it's not your kind of role or responsibility to do that? Then, slightly off at a tangent here, but
I think it is my role, Jim. And I think I've been negligent in truant in my obligations.
That's the front page of the Courier tomorrow. Then.
I think probably I did write about it beforehand. I've written more than one poem about, you know, we're currently living in the Anthropocene, you know, the time, the epoch of the human. And there will be another one that will come after that, which is probably, in a lot of ways, there was an article in the LRB this week about this, about more terrible than life being wiped out from the whole planet is the thought of man not being there and everything else still being there. You know, so grasshoppers and hummingbirds are still going on as they have for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and man won't be there, and language won't be there. So I've written about language.
It's the sort of arrogance of humanity. Oh, the world's doomed, we're all going to die. Well, I think actually,
no.
There'll be a few bugs saying, well, thank goodness for that. We've got a bit of peace now.
It'll be wonderful for them. Yeah, I love the idea.
At some point, does John Glenday, the poet, you know, is it, when do you start writing again then, John? Do you have to, will you know, or will you just have to just grin and bear it kind of thing, or?
No, because I think the mistake I would have made, you know, a few years ago would be, I would be thinking, oh my God, I'm a writer and I'm not writing. And I wasn't taking into account what the process is of being, what does it mean to be a writer? And to me now, I say, well, there's one part of it I'm not doing. Well, I do take notes, and I'm recording things on my phone that'll maybe become a poem later, but I'm just not getting beyond that stage. I'm still keeping a diary, but I don't feel the need at the moment to complete any poem. And I know that there's no great, you know, there's no urgent calls coming from Glasgow saying, you know, that we're desperately needing a Glenday sonnet. You know, is there nothing you can do? You know, so
Yeah.
people will be okay without it. But
Well,
I'm doing the other things that a writer does, and one of them is quite simply I'm looking at old work and trying to hone that, but I'm reading other writers. And it was a decision I made way back last March that if I can't go into a bookshop, I'm going to be bloody buying books online from these bookshops directly, and enjoying other poets' work. And I've done that a lot in the last year. And that's the other half of my job as a poet, is to read other people, not to necessarily write them.
I had a quick glance down to see if Sheila was looking at Red Squirrel and checking John Glendy's purchase order.
But it is true, you know, I'm wanting to know what was being written.
I think I think pretty much I would say if you were to do a poll across the audience tonight, everybody's probably done exactly the same, either gone back to their own book shelves. And I mean, I took that conscious decision as well and started to read through the whole lot. I have to say I didn't get very far. You can't become an umbellifer expert and read your entire bookshop as well. But it's sort of a balance of in between, and the daily walks. Apparently, we're somewhere south of Naples by now. I think if we'd kept the mileage, but
the daily walks are the other important bit, Jim. You're right, because what does a writer do? The other thing that we do is that we're talking about the worlds that we inhabit, you know, and in that respect, for me, poetry is a redemptive act. It's something that saves a part of the world, if you like, and that sounds pretty haughty and self-important. But if I notice that weed and step around it, there's something changes. You know, there's something happened through that, and through the very act of the writer describing something that other people aren't describing, or describing something in a new way, we are drawing attention to it and helping it to say, as I try to say in that poem, do I really exist?
I think what you're probably saying, if I can put thoughts in your head, is you've probably written in the last 9 months several poems, just that you haven't actually put them on paper yet.
That's right. That's exactly it.
Yeah, and it might be 2 years, 3 years, I guess, and it's a fear that possibly, you know, there's a few poets I'm looking at the moment will possibly agree as well, that the fear is that post-pandemic, heavens, there should be a thing called post-pandemic, and that we don't even know what that looks like yet. But the fear for me is, how much does the current Burich influence your poetry? You know, does it give it a different sort of, I was going to say poisoned edge, but and in any way, does it bleed into what, you know? I guess what I'm saying is, if you were to set out now to write Firth, would it be influenced by the extraordinary circumstances that we're all in and affect your thinking?
It's difficult to say what I would do. I suspect it'd be exactly the same. Yeah. I suspect what I tend to do is the great contemporary goings on tend to be very background in my poetry, although they're there, that they colour it and maybe tonally they affect it. But I tend to be, I would still be looking at the umbellifera and describing the overarching hogweed or whatever. Yeah. And yet something of what was beyond that, the huge world that's been transformed by a pandemic, would be somehow in there. But it's an event that's so huge that I would dare not try to describe it, or even a portion of it.
Yeah, I think I took a slightly different approach, in as much as I wrote about 25 poems stroke rants about every morning, every so often. Just I felt kind of quite cathartic, and I got it out of my system. And there's a few folk here I've ventured into reading them, but it was extraordinary because it's not the kind of poetry I would normally have written. It was
but I say I would write from the same poems because I think, I mean, some of these I was finishing off as the pandemic was kicking in. But I look on this as probably the most optimistic and brightest poems I've written. I'll read you another, actually. It's the very last poem in the book, which it's like that wonderful Mexican novel, Pedro Paramo. Everyone's dead in it right at the beginning and they stay dead all the way through it. And it's basically a poem about the inhabitants of Angus, but everyone's dead. And after I'd written it, because I often don't know why I've written a poem and what it's about, I was trying to figure out, why are the dead rising up? Is this the resurrection or is this something else? And I figured out, oh no, it's me that's dead as well. That's why I can hear them. It's called Suddenly, and the title's got a comma at the end of it. But the first time I've done that, and it kind of just hints that there's maybe something else going on afterwards. I'm sorry, it's slightly longer than I usually write.
You have the floor.
I'm on the floor. Suddenly. Suddenly, all the dead sprang up from their lairs, ogling the long, unsavoured air, and over them the high and always distant, but never lonely, clouds accumulating and attenuating, and the Firth all tremulous light and drift, constant in its change, and the larks vocal in their endeavours, from Arbirlet to Barnhill, from Carnoustie to Lucky Slap, in every corner of next to anywhere, the dead, the recent and the long, rose up blinking and joyous among the vetch and harebells, among the scents and voices of the busy, nameless grasses, in a wind they could not touch, those fine old farmers' wives with their crusty old farmers, and brave young lassies with their baffled young men, and the grumbling grey clapjaws and totty babes so punctually dead they had never once rooted at a mother's breast. All up they rose of a single accord into that wonderful summer, and singing, of course, every little last one of them, singing and singing, singing the absence from their hearts, singing towards the weather they would never touch again, singing as if the world would hearken to them, singing as if for me alone, though to this day, for the life of me, I've not the foggiest notion why.
It's wonderful. Thank you, John. It's a lovely poem, that beautiful.
So that's kind of saying,
and a comma at the end of it. You know.
Yeah, little comma, yeah, little comma. This will go on. It's just a pause.
It's just a pause. I think, by the way, it was Souter. We didn't get back to that, but it is Willie Souter that was responsible for that. The three elements you mentioned there.
The other thing that Souter wrote, of course, was one of his definitions of poetry. Was it not? Poetry is a river that deepens into silence.
Yeah,
and you can think of an estuary with that, can't you? A river that deepens into silence.
He had plenty of time to think about it. Unfortunately,
he did indeed. Yeah,
that's for another day. But it's a very haunting place to stand and read poetry. Is in Willie's room in his house.
Wonderful, wonderful place. Yeah,
especially quite frightening to read in Scots there.
Really,
and hopefully get it right. That's a lightning bolt coming out, or just you can hear a sigh. Aye, laddie, no. Or maybe that's just Margaret Gillis Brown behind me. Oh, bless her. John, completely off a slight 90-degree angle here. We've talked before about this sort of notion of work memories, and is that something you could maybe expand on for the audience at all? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, many of the poems in this pamphlet are they're family stories, really. But I describe them as worked memories because often I adapt them for the purpose of the poem sometimes because the detail would be such that it would just hinder the access of the poem for a reader. And other times because it just doesn't work, basically. I mean, I'll give you an example. There's one family story is my brother building a raft when we lived in Moneyfeith and pushing it out when he was on his own, pushing it out into the river, stripping to his underpants and putting all his clothes on this raft and just paddled along holding on to it. And of course the tide changed and started to go out. And he was pulled out by the Budden Ness, holding onto this raft. And eventually there's nothing he could do. He was looking over his shoulder and saying, getting further and further away. He couldn't swim back. He was holding onto this raft with his clothes on it. So eventually he had to let go and strike out for shore. And on the way, he managed to drop his glasses and managed to catch them underwater before they sank, and then had to walk in his underpants through Moneyfeith to our house. And the next day, the harbour master found the clothes of the lifeboat and God knows what else. But all that detail just hampers the poem.
Yeah.
And the poem, if I can find it, is a wee bit different. The poem's actually called Salve Regina, which was an Avo Paired piece of music I was listening to while I was working on it. And I was thinking to myself, you know, I often write ekphrastic poetry where it's an image, a painting or a photograph that has been the starting point for the poem. So why not a piece of music? So it's called Salve Regina. It's true, so much of us is standing water. No wonder you crept down to the shoreline in the last of the light, despite the hungry cold. No wonder you longed to wade out as far as you could go, and then further still, as that boy did once, pushing his clothes on a makeshift raft into the ebb, as far as he could, then still further, until his feet were lifted clear of sand and world, the river cradling his weight towards its grey mouth tenderly, almost lovingly, drawing him in nearer to the point of all but no return, when suddenly, missing everything he had dreaded and loathed and run from, he let go, naked, and struck out back towards his life, from his life, leaving everything of himself but himself on that raft, neatly folded, drifting out to sea.
Poet.
So, kind of, it's the story, but it's not. I've worked it. I've adapted it.
Yeah. What did your brother think of it?
He was delighted that I didn't mention him walking home in his underpants.
Right. Okay.
He liked most about it. But it intrigued him because of course he sees himself in it.
Yeah.
But the thing is, all our memories are worked. That's what memories are. They are workings of these neural connections that we've laid down in childhood or whatever. And each time we remember something, we are reworking it. Quite literally.
It was interesting because we sort of discussed whether it was controversial to do that. I'm not sure it's controversial, or but I think one of the greatest exponents of it for me was Seamus Heaney, who spent, in different circumstances, and some of it was in the Troubles at the time, but he was very much for, a dedication for whoever in his poetry. It's all worked memory at the end of the day. I mean, is there such a thing? Is there such a thing as a poem that's not in some way a worked memory or an influence of memory?
Well, that's right, and it's interesting because a few years ago now, many years ago, I read a poem that was about our former father, and my sister was in the audience. When we gave the reading, she was in the audience, and as I read the book, I introduced it, and I talked about my dad and what he was like for me, and how he was, and how this poem arose. And after the reading, my sister came up and said, "Did you really believe that Dad was like that?" And I said, "He was like that." And she said, "No, not at all. Remember this and that." So she had a complete different set of memories, and even the ones that coincided were different perspectives of the same man. So which is the where does real memory come into that? They're all worked. They're worked
I've had one or two issues, especially with my mother on that matter, saying that never happened.
That's right.
Well, Mum, you're just getting a bit forgetful.
Yeah.
Do you have another poem in your? I should say, actually, folks, if you want, I'm going to leave a little bit at the end for question and answer. I don't know how we'll manage to do that, Jennifer, whether you unmute or. So if you want to chap in on the chat bit there, some Q&A for about the last 10 minutes or so. Or if you've not already, apologies, I haven't actually been looking at that button.
And Jim, folk will be able to unmute themselves.
Right, and ask a question. So if you don't all do it at one time, but yeah, if you put your question in, and then I can maybe do it from there. Look, I'm getting over it. I'm getting better at this.
Well,
I've said before, you got a poem there then, John?
I've probably got another 2 or 3 short ones that are just family poems.
Oh, we've got plenty of time, I think.
And so we'll go back to the weeds again. And this is Wildflower, and it's field scabious. But it's my grandmother who suffered from dementia and lived with us for the last year and a half of her life, and until she had to go, basically had to go into a home eventually. But again, this is a work one, and although there were many instances of how difficult it was for her living with us after her husband died, after my grandfather died, this one never quite happened like this, but I think it's true to what things were.
Yeah.
Wildflower, field scabious. I remember coming across my grandmother at her dressing table in the middle of the night, in the all but darkness. Doolally, my dad had called her. I was 10. Something had woken me, her voice perhaps. She was powdering her face, then dabbing her cardigan shoulders with the powder puff, and then her arms, then trying to brush the loose powder from her lap, all the while muttering to herself, "This isn't the thing. This isn't the thing." Then turning towards me in terror, as if I was the ghost.
Yeah. Is there an element when we write poems like that, John, that you're almost working that out in your system? I mean, I used that word cathartic earlier on in terms of the pandemic stuff I was doing, but is it are you the audience as much as anybody for that?
I think that's a really interesting point, Jim, because yes, I mean, I think I was 10 at the time, and it was quite upsetting to be a child and went, what the hell is happening? You know, this woman that we'd known for years that suddenly drifted off in some sort of psychological sense and we'd lost contact with. It was upsetting. And so for me, it definitely is a working through of how things were in those days.
And also, although it's maybe not in the content of the poem, the context of it, even to an audience, it gives you that you can talk about it.
Yes.
You know, and I'm sure everybody here will be able to, almost everybody. I mean, I've done work with Alzheimer's Scotland, and it just touches on just everybody nowadays. And I think that's where you connect as a poet. You can, although it's your personal words memory experience, that's where people can connect with it.
Absolutely.
Do you have another poem you were going to? You had 2 or 3.
I'll do another Wildflower. This is my dad. So I hope my sister's not listening.
Well, it's being recorded, so.
That's right. Railless Mayweed. That was. I was going to say ugly. It was unremarkable of wildflowers. You'd hardly notice it, but it always grows where things that we've built have been destroyed. In concrete yards and whatever.
Yeah.
Pineapple weed, that's the other name for it.
Yeah.
And it's really just a poem about my dad. He had a variety of jobs. He'd been working for a grocer's before the war, and after the war, he found it difficult working in one place for very long. But often it was because he was laid off and he would have to find more work. And this is just talking about the different places he may have worked, although again, he didn't work in all these Dundee factories, but 2 or 3 of them he did work in. So it's the weed itself that's talking in this poem. It's rayless mayweed. I think probably the first time ever it's recited a poem. Wildflower, rayless mayweed. Each time he was rooted out from his workplace in his flat cap and tweed coat, laid off from the warehouse or the factory going under, NCR, Timex, Astral, Bonnerlong, places he worked then couldn't, displaced by a supermarket perhaps, or a new play park. I was always just behind him, moving in on the cleared concrete forecourts and bulldozed yards, thriving among the dirt and swarf and oil, my wasteland Eden. Like him, so ordinary and despised. Both of us, nothing much to look at, though we held our heads up as best we could, despite it all. Him in his particular way, and me in mine.
Wonderful.
My dad used to wear a shirt and tie to work. You know, he worked in a warehouse in a factory, but he always went with a shirt and tie on.
Was that now? Where was that poem first published, John? Was that?
That's been published nowhere but in this pamphlet, I don't think.
Right. Okay. And it was. I remember there's one of my. I'm now waffling a little bit, but way back, Jings. Oh, you did a reading at Wigton.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a poem in there about your father and his work, which I was stuck with me.
Yeah, no, that I'm trying to think which one it was, but it'd be before this poem. I often come back to that because.
Is that in Golden? Was it in Golden Mean? That one was it?
Yes, because there's a poem in there. I think it's called "A Pint of Light" about him coming back from the pub.
That's it. That's the one. It stuck with me. It's a lovely poem. That not that I'm putting you on a spot.
No, but yeah, I mean, he worked in a variety of places, and it wasn't bad. I mean, I've said this before. I can vividly remember this. I haven't written. I should have written a poem about this one, but there was a firm, Astral, that I mentioned there, which made white goods. And he was laid off from there, and the last thing he did was to get an automatic washing machine, which probably came off the back of a lorry when the place was closed down, to be honest, because he never had much money. But we got an automatic washing machine in our wee council house in Moneyfieth. And yeah, Mum put it in the cupboard. We had a cupboard. She was going about, oh, the electricity this will use. But when she first put it on, we sat round and watched the washing go around because it was so amazing. You know, we sat and watched the washing.
Now, surely there's a poem in there somewhere.
I know you'd think so, but...
or a single flower appears out of the screen. John! Is it now... Before I forget, what I'll do, folks, is that we're talking there about John's books. I'll send Jennifer so she can post out to everybody that's been here the links if you want to invest in John's, any of them, but in particular the one he's reading from this evening. You're more than welcome. John, where were we? Oh, you had three. You were going to read another one. We've got.
Yeah, I was trying to think. I remember what the third one is.
The third one.
There's a section in the book that's kind of strange. It's all sort of prose poems that are based on, or take the idea of the metamorphoses, you know, of its metamorphoses, where various human beings are transformed into something else, usually because the gods are displeased or the gods are after them in some way or another. And I did this with my family, and I'll read one of these at least. My mother came from London and moved up here during the war because they were pretty well bombed out of their home, and stayed there ever since. But she was a great swimmer in her youth, and I remember her telling me the story of seeing that she would dive from the high board at Arbroath outdoor pool. You know, it was, I don't know how, 25 feet, 30 feet, it was high. And then when she got up there, she was terrified and just jumped off. She couldn't come down the steps, she just jumped off. And I just tied that in with her beginnings of married life. And it's Leda and the Swan is the episode in the Metamorphoses. Leda. In her snow-white bathing costume and pastel cap, Mother plummets feet first from the 25-foot board at Arbroath outdoor pool, holding her nose, a bit heavier now and not so confident she could dive as promised. But still, he is almost impressed, watching her break surface through a roar of chlorine bubbles and cold. And now she holds up her arms, rising into his arms, through his arms, out of his arms, and beyond his arms. Her hands gripping the polished handlebar of a silver cross pram, freighted with something very small and uncomforted and awake, somewhere between that terraced council house and the only shop, still blinking the water from her eyes, still gasping for breath.
John, you're just wonderful poetry. I think there's one of the things I keep saying about listening to other poets, and it's great that you say that you read lots of, you know, that. Do you get the same as me where you think, oh, Jings, I wish I'd written that, but particularly, you know, you'll get a line, you think, oh, you know, I wish I'd written that one. There's a hook, you'll think that's just, and it's because it's just words. You think, how could I not have got that? Do you get? I think that's is that why some poets don't read other people's work? Of course, you know, they say that. Just.
Well, it's often it's a mistake I made when I was in my teens and early 20s that I was very worried about reading contemporary poetry anyway. I would always read, you know, Eliot or Tennyson or Shakespeare or Donne or whatever. But contemporary poetry, I thought if I read too much of this, I'll just sound like them. But the thing is, if you don't read them, that's when you're more likely to sound like everyone else, because you haven't learned from the way other people have tackled the same problems that you as a writer are having to tackle. And the way to sound like yourself is to read everybody. And what you're doing you know, coming back to a virological comparison, what you're doing is you're immunizing yourself against their poetry. It's so infective and it's so arousing in a way that you read it and you read it and you read it and you become semi-immune to it. And when you're immune to it, it's part of your DNA then.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I feel all these writers are part of me.
Yeah,
that's right.
Completely agree. I kind of want to cheer a little bit there, but yeah, I absolutely agree. Everybody, you should read everybody's poetry. We don't all have a bottomless pit of money, unfortunately, but read as much as you can. That's and I suppose there's a little message in there is support locally, bookshops, and support publishers, small publishers, and all the rest of it as best you can. Is there now? We've got about, well, let me check my timing here. We've got about 10, 15 minutes now. We were started a little bit late, so finished just a little bit late. But is that questions? Has anybody got some questions for John? And I'll shut up, because I've got loads of questions still. But does there anybody want to ask John a question?
It's always the quietest bit of the evening.
I know. The tumbleweeds bouncing across this. Yeah. I guess my next question, really, John, is you kind of answered it by saying you haven't written for months, but when you get that phone call or you get that urge to you know, to say, right, I'm you know, I feel I've got another pamphlet I'd like to start. Where do you start on that? Is it you've got poetry or you've got? Do you have a series of themes, or is there a particular one thing you want to expand across a whole pamphlet? Or what's your next plan?
It's a good question, Jim. I mean, this pamphlet on the Firth, I had no idea what I was going to be writing about, and it was when the idea of I'll just write what's around me. I mean, someone once said that the most important feelings for us are the most parochial. The things that are right beside us are the most important. And it's once I got that idea, it just all takes off from there.
So is there poems that you thought would suit the Firth but haven't made it and might get into the next thing then? Is there?
There's certainly, I mean, there's poems that didn't fit, and because you're what I love about a pamphlet is you're limited for space. So I think we took out about 5 or 6 poems, and which was a great thing to do because they're always the 5 or 6 weakest, and the ones that I always knew shouldn't really be there.
But they might appear at some point, but you'll not tell us that they were the weakest, of course.
Only if I got desperate that appeared. But then I'll rework things. One of the other things, apart from writers worrying that if they read too much of other people's work, they'll sound like them and they won't be individual. The other mistake is people often say to me, "But this has been said before. You know, I'm writing a poem about the river as a metaphor for such and such, but it's been done before. You know, so maybe I should write about something else." But we're always writing. I mean, I think I've only written the one poem my entire life. You know, there's only really one huge theme that everything else fits into.
I think everybody would. Yeah, sorry.
No, but we're just constantly saying what's been said before, but we're doing it in our own way, and it needs said again. You know,
I think every writer or poet that's listening in would agree that you have to get over that initial hump of saying, "Oh no, you know, this has been written before." No, it's not in your voice. It hasn't. So
that's right, and I love it when I'll read a poem by another writer and think, "Oh, that reminds me. It's the same as it's similar to this by this other poet," and yet they're tackling it in completely different ways. You know,
when well, I guess on that you mentioned about revisiting and rewriting. Obviously, I mean, would you go back to would you go back to one of your pamphlets or pieces of work that's actually won an award? Would you go back to a poem in that and rewrite it? Would you dare to do that, or do you feel you're not allowed to do that in some way?
No, I would think I can do what I want. You know, I can do what I like.
Yeah,
but I don't think I would have the urge to. I think I've moved on from that poem.
Yeah.
Usually I've moved on.
Yeah. That's interesting, that. Yeah.
The only poems I go back to are ones that haven't worked. They're all these draft poems that are in a huge folder marked and didn't quite make it.
Yeah.
And I'll go back to them and I'll fillet them. It's like having an Austin Allegro in your drive that you can't get to start, but you can take the wheels off and put it on something else, you know.
For those younger in the audience, an Austin Allegro was a car.
Jim, I noticed there's some questions in the chat.
Right, sorry, I've missed them then, sorry. Right, okay, where are we? Here we go. I've got, where are we? Oh, jings. You have to see, sorry, I keep saying my one and only joke about Zoom, of course, is it should be a nice lolly confined to history of names.
Well, I noticed there was one from Finola, if she wants to ask it.
Finola, yes, Finola Scott. Are you there, Finola? Yeah.
Sorry if I jumped the queue.
Not at all.
I was at St Andrews and was at the launch, the reading that you did, the collaboration that you did with Maria.
Oh yes.
The artwork and your poems, and it was just such a lovely event. And the pamphlet was gorgeous. And you mentioned earlier on there that you did ethcastic writing, and I just wondered if that was something that you attempted to do more of.
I would love to do more of that, Finola. I particularly enjoy cross-genre things where you're working with an artist or working with a musician, say. Yeah. Part of the reason for that is because, I say this often, I feel I've got no imagination at all. I can't start things off myself at all. So I need another art form to piggyback, if you like, to get me going. And when I do, then the poems can appear quite quickly once I have that vehicle for my lack of imagination. I would love to do it again.
It was lovely, the use of her talking about the use of space, and you also talking about the use of space and the importance of actually space. And that's a really challenging thing as a writer. You know, you write a poem and you go, oh, there's too many words in that poem.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
And one of the greatest tools a writer has is difficulty. It's a problem, and you could say that Mira, the pamphlet I did with Maria, it's a little tiny book.
Yeah, yeah,
And so you couldn't have very many big poems or long poems in it.
yeah,
And I loved the fact that I could only have maybe 6, 8, 10 lines most.
yeah.
It was a wonderful, liberating thing.
I was talking to my daughter, who's a physical artist, and we were talking about the business of responding to prompts. And I know that some people don't like that. And because I wouldn't say we're artists, but the fact that we were looking at the creative process, and it was interesting. So the very fact that the book was tiny was both a challenge, but it was also the solution to the problem.
Yes, exactly right. It was the solution. And this is all the space I've got, therefore that's what I'm going to need.
Yeah, yeah. That's great. Thank you very much for that. Super.
I noticed David Bleeman.
David, you had a question. Are you there?
Yeah, I mean, I find events like this give me structure, because, you know, I kind of express an interest, I get the Zoom link and so on, and then I actually do it. But in terms of organizing, if you like, organizing my kind of poetic life, so that's not too pretentious, things like to-do lists, which I might make, don't give me structure, because I sort of never manage to do the stuff that I put on a list. And what I'm interested in is the balance. What do you think about the issue of balance in one's life between things that one knows one should do and one plans to do, and just, you know, dreaming or, you know, being carried away with a particular thought?
I think that balance is incredibly important, and that the being carried away bit isn't one that you should underestimate. I think that's a really important and integral part of being a writer, is being distracted. I loved what you said about to-do lists, because I'm useless with to-do lists, because I write them up and then I forget them. And what have I done with my to-do list? I've lost it, you know, and never ever managed to work that way. Electronic diaries are slightly better, because I can put things I have to do in them, and I get a little noise that tells me that this needs to be done now. But I'm quite disorganized that way. But again, as I said with Finola, I look on that as one of my benefits as a writer, is that I've always been highly distractible and move from what I should be looking at, what I should be reading, to something I'm not really supposed to be reading. But gosh, isn't it interesting? You know, so both incredibly important.
Sorry, okay, David. Yep. Gillian, I think Gillian Joyce, is you there? I think you had a question. Is Gillian still there?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yeah,
I can hear you.
Yeah. Right. Hi, David. I just wondered, was there a particular, sorry, not David, John. Was there a particular moment where something in the landscape around you prompted you to start trying to describe it, or was that something you moved on to later on?
No, Gillian, it's always been there.
That's always been, yeah.
Always been there. I can remember. I mean, I wanted to be a writer really all my life, all the time I can remember. And I can still clearly remember being in my teens, late teens, and looking at a cloud and thinking, you know, because I was finding it really difficult writing again. I was still searching for my voice, and it was going to be decades before I found it. And I was struggling to write. Looking at this cloud and thinking, if I could describe that adequately, that I could see it in my mind's eye when I read what I'd written, I would never need to write anything else again. Just to describe one cloud is all I'd need to do perfectly, you know. And of course, I've never managed to do it. But I've always been looking at landscape.
Yeah.
And of course,
was it something about the urban? Sorry.
No, it's okay. Go on, Julie.
Was it something about the urban environment with the sort of natural landscape? Was it something about them meeting that's sort of spurred it on, or was it just something outside of? No, it wouldn't be outside the environment you're in, was it?
I think you're right, but it's not something I've I've considered before. I mean, where I grew up in a housing estate in Firth, it was a fairly new one when we moved there, but I didn't know it at the time. And it was on the very edge of the town. So when I went out my door and crossed the road, I was in fields. And there was a river there was a railway line. And so it was a juncture between two worlds, very much.
Yeah. I grew up somewhere similar, and I always felt when I was very young, we moved there when I was about 5, but when I was very young, it felt, and I was sort of allowed out with another few kids, do you know what I mean? It felt like you were going from, this concrete jungle sort of thing, a few steps and you were in like sort of almost somewhere magical. And I think that always stuck with me when later on I was trying to write, and I could never felt I could describe anything adequately, but those sort of wee moments and those in-betweens got me started on a few things. I just wondered, and I wondered, were you encouraged as a writer when you were younger?
No, that probably would have done for me as a writer if it had any encouragement at all. No, it's not true. My mother was quite encouraging. Well, she encouraged me by reading, because she was a real avid reader. So, all my life I've read a lot, and she really encouraged that way. But I don't think in those days nobody would encourage their child to be a writer. Maybe a journalist might be possible, but it was such a useless, dead-end, hopeless profession that
Still is. I could trust me, it is. Yeah. Sorry, Gillian, I talked over.
No, that's fine. No, it was. I'm always interested in that from people, how they kept going. To get where they are, I always find interesting, because most people I know weren't encouraged, at any point.
Despite that.
Except when they got to meet other writers,
Even when I was at university, I mean, I went and studied English at Edinburgh, and I dropped out after 2 years, this mistaken thing that I could do the artistic thing and just drop out and be a kind of hippie writer, and it was a terrible mistake. But I remember one of my tutors, he was a lovely guy, and he was teaching us Thomas Hardy it was he was doing, and saying to me, "John, I know you want to be a poet, but you've got to write the bloody essays, and that
do the miles.
Do the miles," and I never ever did it. That's what a mistake it was.
I think we've got time for one last question. Is Leslie Traynor still about? Leslie, I can't see you.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh,
Actually, hi, John. I've loved hearing your poetry. And I think you've really answered this, because my question was, are you making conscious decisions about structure when you're writing for a pamphlet compared to a longer book? And you've answered it really, especially when you were talking about your ekphrastic, the very small booklet. But what I would have found if I was writing, a pamphlet or a longer book, and been given the freedom of lines in a longer volume, is that I might not be doing as good a job. Do you know what I mean? How do you feel about the difference?
How do you mean you wouldn't be doing as good a job?
Well, perhaps if you are constrained and you're having to make every word count, and you're maybe better editing, maybe that's what I'm thinking of. Too much freedom. Is that a bad thing?
Too much freedom for me is a bad thing. I think that my creative process, there has to be lots of freedom in where I get my material from and what I'm doing with it in the initial phases, when I'm at the point where I'm not really sure what I'm writing about still, and just know I'm putting words together and images together. I need that, but I also need this rigorous constraint of either this is all the space you've got, a few column inches to fill, or this is who your audience is, And that's unintelligible to them the way you've written it at the moment. How are you going to change it so it is intelligible, so it can be accessed by someone who's not from your context, who didn't grow up in a housing estate in the edge of money Firth, whose brother didn't go out on a raft? You know, how are you going to make it credible and accessible to them? And so the second stage of my writing is when I have a draft down on paper and I begin working with it, and that is pretty rigorous, and it tends to follow a very predictable pattern of seeing how much of the poem I can throw away, because it's always the words that get in the way.
What I'm thinking of as well is that personally, I may have crafted a poem, and I really think that's the best I can really do with it. And then I'm told by an editor or submission, too many lines. And I'm thinking, this is it at its best. If I cut, you know, something's going to be lost here. Have you ever felt like that?
Usually, I've occasionally had editors say, could I change this? And I'm usually okay with that. You know, I always think, well, if I don't like what they've done with it, I'll go back eventually to my version. You know, I'll just hang on to the original version I've got. But usually, if it involves taking something out, I'm quite pleased. I always feel that in my drafts that I begin the poem too late and I end, and you know, I begin the poem too early and end it too late. You know, I do all this introductory waffle, and then there's a bit of poem, and then there's this summing up that doesn't need to be there either. So anything that can be chopped out, I usually quite like that. But I would never agree to anything that I didn't feel comfortable with. So if an editor said they wanted to, you know, remove what I thought were the key stanzas, then I wouldn't do it. But usually I'm quite happy.
Thank you, Leslie. I think I'm looking at my watch, Jennifer. We've probably, I don't want to, I'm sure you've all got your homework to do for tomorrow. So hopefully everybody's enjoyed their hour or so with John. I don't know how we don't do rounds of applause, or let me just wave at each other or something, or do the double thumbs up or something. I hope you've enjoyed that. Thank you, John. It's been absolutely a pleasure. If it's just been you and I'd have been happy. We could have blethered for a long time yet. And
Thanks so much, Jim.
Hopefully we'll do that in real time soon.
I know, yeah. Who knows when readings are going to start again?
Well, you've got a visit with me up the East Perthshire and Angus Glen to the Paternico Museum sometime.
I mean, the great thing for me is the lockdown hasn't affected my readings very much, you know, because most of my readings would only be 6 adults from 2 different households anyway.
Yeah, sponsored by the post office for the post box. So I hope everybody's enjoyed this. It'll be the first of hopefully we're going to do 1 or 2 more in this kind of lockdown midden that we're in. I'm looking at the corner with Jennifer there. We've already talked about one for roundabout. Well, I think I'm on next Saturday morning with Leela, and if anybody fancies that. And then the following Sunday, more details to follow. I'm going to host a thing with a chap called Paul McGratty, who's working at Glasgow University doing some.
Oh yeah, I know Paul's work.
Paul, he's done some fantastic work just now on Burns, since it's the closest we can get to the 25th. You'd be more than welcome to come along, John, as well to that. And then from that, we'll take it from there.
Yeah, send me the details for that, John.
I will do, yeah.
I like Paul's work.
Yeah, so there's a lot to be done on that. This is all assuming, of course, that somebody hasn't pushed a big red button a week on Wednesday, and we're no. But the good thing, even if they do push that big red button, John, is that all the weeds and that will still be happy because they'll still be here.
That's right. They'll be delighted.
It's just us that will not be. As I say, we'll post up the links to John's books if anybody wants to get a copy of that. Jennifer, I'll shut up now and hand back to you. Thanks again, John.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you both very much. And thank you all for coming. Like me, I'm sure you found it to be just a wonderful night of listening to you, John. I've learned so much. And your analogy with the flower growing in the wrong place, well, that's made means a lot to me. That's what's been wrong all my life. But wonderful to hear you talking about your writing, and lovely relaxed atmosphere with you and Jim. And I really, although I'm in my own home, it was as if we were just sitting round a fire having a lovely night together. So it's your turn next week, Jim. You'll be the one that's being interviewed, and so will Leela. So that'll be most interesting next Saturday morning. We'll post it all up. And then the following Sunday will be the second of our Makar Muses, or whatever we want to call it. Thank you everybody for coming. And if you have any questions or anything, just drop me an email, and we'll include that in the recording, and we can put some stuff on at the end of it.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you very much.
Thank you. Stay safe, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.